get this party started, as they say. All right. My name is Victor Hanjan. I'm with Kyiv School of Economics, and I will be chairing this session today. So we have well-being and labor markets. We have 3 wonderful presentations. So the rules are simple. We have about 15 to 20 tops minutes for presentation, and I have, these things to show. So that I'll try to keep it within time limits. Then we have about 5 minutes for discussion, and then we'll have 5 minutes for questions. So very simple. And our first presenter is Hartmut Lehmann from University of Bologna. And there's a microphone over there, so. Yeah. And a clicker.
Okay. Okay, good morning. I mean, this is a paper, a joint paper with Norberto Pignati from ISET in Georgia. And it's about informal employment relationships and segmentation, whether there is segmentation in the Ukrainian labor market along the formal-informal divide. Now, we have written a paper a long time ago in 2007, which is one of the most downloaded papers at IZA, actually, and maybe because it was never published as a journal article. So we have basically not just updated it, but restructured this paper and added one more wave of the analysis, for reasons I will talk about in a second. Okay, so our main research questions here are, is the Ukrainian labor market segmented along the formal-informal divide? Actually, how heterogeneous is informal employment? Are there differences if we compare dependent salaried employment and self-employment? A third question would be, is the informal sector itself segmented, which means that there is a lower tier free entry segment where everybody can enter, but where the conditions are bad and there are low wages. And we have an upper tier, which is rationed, where not everybody can get in, where you have good conditions and high wages. And the fourth question is, are the traditional paradigms regarding informality refined in our framework to analyze the issue in the Ukrainian labor market? So these are the questions that we want to address in this paper. Okay, so basically, normally when you test for segmentation, the empirical literature has 2 approaches. On one hand, you look at mobility between different labor market states. So our first method is to look at short-term and medium-term transition probabilities between 7 states. So we have formal salaried employment. And as you will see from the ULMS, we can infer whether people are voluntary informal, whether they are involuntary informal. They don't want to be informal, but their employer or the circumstances force them to be. Then we have self-employed formal and self-employed informal. And the other 2 states of the labor market, apart from employment here, would be unemployment, of course, and out of the labor force. Then the second method is to essentially estimate wage gaps at the mean and more recently, in some papers, also across the entire distribution. And sorry, when it comes to wage gaps at the mean regressions, we have pooled OLS regressions, we have pooled Hackett with a Heckman correction term regressions, and we have fixed effects regressions to take account of time invariant unobserved heterogeneity among individuals. And The second leg of the wage gap analysis is essentially pooled. It's quantile regression, where we do pooled quantile regression, which is like corresponding to OLS, if you like. And then we have fixed effects quantile regressions. Now, let's say historically, it has been difficult to get consistent estimates when you have a short panel doing fixed effect quantile regression. There is a new methodology, a new approach developed by Powell from Rand Corporation, that allows fixed effect quantile regression to have consistent estimates, even if you have only, let's say, 3 waves, like we will use here. Now, when you look at the informality literature, there are certain issues. One is definitions. How to define, actually, informality? And so there is the productive ILO definition, which essentially characterizes informality in the labor market by job characteristics. So non-professionals, unskilled, marginal jobs, non-professional self-employed, domestic and family workers, and workers in small firms with up to 5 employees are considered all informal. And then we have the legalistic social protection definition, which characterizes informality in the labor market by non-compliance to the state regarding labor laws and social security systems. Okay? And we have waged workers and the self-employed that are non-compliant or without access to the social security system or pension system with no registration or contract. We avoid conceptual fuzziness by just strictly adhering to this legalistic social protection definition. So essentially, informal wage employment is no contract for the employment relationship, and informal self-employment, no registration of economic activity. Okay, so that's how we define this. Now, when it comes to looking at the theoretical background of this issue of segmentation, we essentially can think about 3 schools. We have the traditional school going back to Lewis and Harris and Todaro, where formal jobs are good jobs, informal jobs are bad jobs, and workers, because there are no unemployment benefit systems in most developing countries, wait in informal employment to eventually enter the formal labor market. We have a revisionist school, if you like, spearheaded by Maloney, but going back certainly to Rosenzweig, actually, and De Soto, that the labor market is integrated. So workers choose freely where to locate over their working life in order, given their characteristics, given their abilities, given their skills, they locate where they want in order to maximize their utility. And then we have a third paradigm, which would say that the informal labor market is actually heterogeneous, or is segmented within itself with the already mentioned free entry lower tier and the rationed upper tier. Now, actually, Elinor Ostrom, she did a lot about informality, and there's a nice book by Gua, Gasnobis, Kanbo, and Ostrom, where most of the authors are very critical of this dichotomous view of labor markets in developing countries along the formal-informal divide. So for Gua, Casnobis et al., formal and informal employments are metaphors with context-dependent connotations. And actually, this literature says it's not important whether relationships are formal or informal. What matters is whether the arrangement, whether it's formal or informal, achieves a certain policy objective. So if you want to, for example, formalize certain things about about the commons in developing countries where people for centuries have engaged in informal relationships, that might be actually detrimental to their well-being. It might be actually better to just improve the informal arrangements. Some empirical labor economists are also very critical of the idea of labor market segmentation and actually maintain that if once you control well for unobserved heterogeneity, basically the selection gaps disappear or become minimal. So this is, if you like, in line with paradigm 2 to some degree, but it's more econometrically based. Now there are some papers, I think to not spend too much time on this, there are some papers that find either that the labor market is integrated or that it is segmented. In this early study, we find certainly for informal salaried employees that the labor market is segmented. In other words, there are the informal salaried employees are rationed out of the formal sector and would like, though, to enter the formal sector. But for the self-employed, we find this segmentation within the informal sector, and we find similar results for Russia. Lehmann and Zaitseva, we did a paper where we find similar results on that. Okay, now I don't want to talk about, I have only 5 more minutes, so I haven't even started. So anyway, so the ULMS is clear. Now the only thing I want to say is because we have the Great Recession between 2007 and 2012, we do not include 2012 in the analysis. We just look at 2003, 2004, and 2007. Okay. Now, basically, here are the questions that capture formality, informality. Tell me, please, are you officially registered at this job? That is, are you on a work roster, work agreement, or contract? If you're registered, you're formal. If you're non-registered, you are informal. And then we ask, why aren't you officially registered? And then employer doesn't want to register. So if that's the answer, you are involuntary informal salaried employee. I don't want to register, or both the employer and I do not want to register. So 1 is involuntary, 2 and 3 is voluntary here. And then self-employed, is your activity registered? Obviously, yes, you're a formal self-employed. No, you're an informal. So let me say, I mean, I will need 5 more minutes, I think. Anyway, so now, of course, you know, because people always say, well, there are lots of, let's say, realizations of informality in a transition or post-transition country. You have envelope payments, you know, people within let's say, employers don't pay Social Security contributions, but you are in a formal firm whose activity is registered, and so on. So there are lots of also people might do some additional casual activities where they drive with their car around. I mean, they used to do this in Ukraine. They don't do it anymore, I think, probably. And they give you a ride for 5 hryvnia or something. No? All those things we're aware of, but we look only at informality at the main job. Okay? And so this is our scheme of. So if you're registered, you're formal. If you're unregistered, you're informal. And in the case of wage employment, we also have involuntary and voluntary. Okay, this is a picture to show that if you exclude agriculture, then sorry, so here I should do this. Then we have here this very thick tail to the left of the formal salaried wages. On the other hand, if you exclude it, it's this line. If you exclude agriculture, this mass is much less. So that's why we do we look at when we do the regressions, we look at including everybody and excluding self-employment, whether it's formal or informal, self-employment in agriculture, to essentially show that the results are not driven by agriculture. Okay, now the methods, we look at transition probabilities. So let me, and especially there, we look at duration of state occupancy. The idea is there have been lots of studies that have done a lot of gymnastics to compare the flows from formal to informal and from informal to formal. The problem with this is, of course, that formal is normally a large stock, while informal is a small stock. So when you compare them without adjusting them, you get meaningless results. So we don't do this here. What we do is we look especially at long-term transitions and see where do people after 4 years end up, right? And if most of them entered formal employment, then this is an indication for us that they basically all use informal employment to enter formal employment. If they don't, if they stay in the state where they are, then this is their voluntary choice. And this we see here. So let me just talk about the. So if you look at the diagonal entries here, which are bold, you will see that there are some very stable states: formal salaried, self-employed formal, self-employed informal, and of course out of the labor force. While unemployment, involuntary informal and voluntary informal are very volatile. Yeah. Okay. So, and the other interesting point is that we can see that nearly half of the voluntary informal flow into formal salaried, and more than 40% of the involuntary informal flow into formal salaried. So by far the most important state where people want to go, if their state is volatile, which means they don't really want to stay there, they don't want to be there, is formal salaried employment. This is not true, certainly not to a great degree. This is not true of self-employment informal. We can see that nearly half the people after 4 years still are in the same state. Yeah? So instead of doing all this gymnastics, we just look at these simple transition probabilities, but looking at comparing a short and the long span. Here I only show the long span. Okay, then let me talk very briefly about the regressions. So, I mean, the one that is particularly relevant would be, of course, the fixed effects regression. And here you can see we have 4 dummies. This is always relative to formal salaried, right? And you can see that the voluntary informal have at the mean a wage premium that does not disappear when you control for unobserved heterogeneity. The involuntary informal have a penalty at the mean that, however, disappears when you have fixed effects. So this would be an indication that it's a selection issue. They have worse characteristics. Once you control for them, it disappears. And the self-employed and the self-employed informal have at the mean, even if you control for unobserved heterogeneity, they have, as you can see, a premium. Okay? Now, so this would indicate in a way that also for salaried employees, the labor market is integrated, it's not segmented. However, when you look at, and that's the last slide, when you look at the quantile regressions, you can see, for example, that the involuntary informal have essentially, in the first 3 deciles, they have a wage penalty, and also in the 8th decile. In the other ones, they do not. So this would clearly state that, I mean, according on this measure, that the labor market is segmented. What is interesting is that as far as the self-employed, I mean, of course, the formal self-employed have high premium relative to formal salaried workers. That's not surprising, since we include here entrepreneurs, also some of them. But what's interesting is that also the self-employed informal have a rising, well, it's not monotonically rising, but it is rising, have a rising premium. So the self-employment, informal self-employment, is not segmented in the sense that you have penalties at the lower part of the distributions and you have premium in the upper part. You have essentially premium everywhere. Only at the lower part the premium is small. While it's high, you know, this is like 60%, 60% wage premium. So finally, so from the quantile wage gap analysis and from the transition analysis, we can infer that informal salaried employment is, there is some segmentation. Many informal employees use the state as a waiting stage to get into formal salaried employment. Dependent informal seems to be segmented within itself with a lower undesirable tier and an upper desirable tier, which is, this is actually the innovation a bit, that, for example, for the voluntary informal, you have actually a penalty at the lowest decile, and you have a premium in the upper, here in the upper deciles, here. Yeah, up to the 9th decile, okay? Then the informal self-employed like their state in great numbers and seem in terms of earnings better off than formal employees, no matter what the level of productivity. Sorry that I over.
All right, thank you very much. So the discussant is Hanna Onishchenko. Oh, there you are. Right, so it's about 5 minutes. And then we'll proceed with questions. Okay. I hope you have some.
Okay. Welcome, guests of the conference. And my name is Hanna Onishchenko. I'm working for the National Bank of Ukraine. First of all, it was a great pleasure to read the article. And it's a really good starting point to get acquaintance with the topic. Because for me, labor market segmentation was a new one. And paper gave me an ability to easily follow the the literature, how it was researched previously, and what methods are appropriate. The question is very important because labor segmentation is very important because it helps to study the job market patterns, and it indirectly assess the workers' job satisfaction. That is really in line with the topic of our conference. In the paper, there is a really extensive descriptive statistics, which allows you to understand what is the field in Ukraine in particular, and if you are like a freshman in this topic, you will easily understand what happened and how it affects the future results. And just to complete the picture, I would like to suggest the author used in different industries to when analyze the situation in descriptive statistics. But for me, it was, in a moment, I didn't understand what are the size and the significance. For example, agriculture was excluded from the final results, but I don't know how significant is this, like the group of these people. In my humble opinion, wage distribution of different types of employment across the industries. And gender also may be useful because it will allow you to go deeper and understand just not the whole market, but each particular category. And will lead to probably more specific results. I mean, the policy implications. I was impressed with the accuracy of models. I mean, like you used 3 models and you used a really precise robustness check. And for me, you gave me an idea for my own paper, and I believe in the obtained results. So thank you for that. I just want, after the reading of the paper, for me, I raised several questions, and I hope in the future they will be answered because, the question now, what is the ratio of the individuals who switch the industry during the transition between employment status? Because in general, I realize that yes, the involuntary unemployment is not desired state and it is a transition state, but whether involuntary employment, like the person changed the industry as a whole, or it changed just the status, and how it affects the wage. Then another question is whether labor markets possess similar characteristics across the gender and the age group. So either the situation and the penalty is the same for the youth, for example, or mid-age people. Finally, how educational field, like whether educational field has an effect on employment pattern. So, for example, whether person who works and after they switch also switch the field of education, for example. So how this involuntary or voluntary switching between employment stage is affected by the internal, field of internal factors like field of knowledge or something like that. To sum up, I would like to thank you for the great excursus to the theory of labor market segmentation. And the questions that you raised, they allowed not the wide auditory to think about, and they give you the the impediment to do more research and apply techniques you used in our own papers. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Hannah. We have a very short Q&A session, just a couple of minutes. Do we have maybe 2 questions? All right.
Yeah, thanks for the nice paper. My question is informality actually a feature of the labor market institutions in Ukraine, or is this a specific feature of some sectors or some economic parts of the economy? So I would be interested, do you know a little bit more about profiles of where are the informal people employed or hired? Is this specific firm types? Is this specific sectors except for agriculture?
Go ahead. have to answer right away. Well, I mean, in the paper, we just look in general at informality, and we just test for segmentation. I agree, and it's only a first step, actually, in a sense. No? So essentially, once you get these results, and I can also answer your question, one needs, it's clear, one needs to check, you know, what are the institutional, what is the institutional framework that might cause this, or are people concentrate? Of course, they are concentrated. I mean, we did this with the Thomas Domen paper on risk and informality. They're concentrated in certain industries. Clearly, I mean, I don't show this here, but you know, in a long presentation, you have the distribution by occupation, you have the distribution by industry, and so on. And unsurprisingly, informal employment is concentrated in construction, in retail, services, and so on. And public administration, there are no informal, or actually there are a few informal employees somehow, but very few. If you look at managers, they're all formal, you know, which is also unsurprising. Unskilled, low-skilled people, you get a lot of. So we did all. I mean, you know, we've done this ad nauseum in a sense. You know, since we worked on this for years. So, so also when it comes to age, you know, but let me finish it. But I think it's of course important to really look at the drivers, if there are institutional institutional drivers. But I mean, relative to developing countries, actually the informal rate is not that high. No, I mean. And as we've seen, most people eventually enter actually formal salaried employment. Now, you know, we did in this older paper, we did, and also in some material, we looked at age groups, for example. And of course, you look at the young, you look at the over 50, and the core group. But here in this paper, I just wanted to generally you know, have also a lot of statistical power to test the stuff, right? And that also, I mean, the issue of whether people change industry. Again, if you do it at the, or if you look at transition within industry, or you condition on industry, then of course you have very few observations. And again, you know, there are certain industries, so you can take out just those industries and look there what happens, where the majority of the informal are. Okay, but also gender, of course you can, I mean, in this Russian paper we do with Angelika Zaitseva, we look at actually informal gaps across gender. No? So. But I mean, this is a paper meant to broadly test segmentation in Ukraine, which doesn't mean that one cannot do other papers. For example, we do have job satisfaction and life satisfaction questions in the Ukrainian, in the ULMS. So another paper, which would have been actually a better paper for this conference, will be to look at informality and job and life satisfaction. Anyway.
All right, thank you. We are unfortunately really running late, a little bit late now, so I encourage you to save your questions. Sorry about that. So I will thank you very much once again, Professor Lehmann, and I'm inviting Olha Kupets. She is a professor at Kyiv School of Economics and also a fellow researcher at ESA.
Thank you. Thank you, organizers Elena Nizalova, for organizing this conference on this important topic that motivates to spend some time on research between my consultancy work for the World Bank, ILO, and many other international organizations. So the topic is youth on the move, job mobility and well-being at work in transition economies. And quite standard outline. I start from the youth on job mobility and its effect. And first start from traditional career for life, supported by labor economists and social economists, human capital and labor market segmentation theories. And according to this theory, initial job shopping by young people can be beneficial in terms of higher wages in the end. But in general, high mobility workers are considered, perceived by employers as less productive, as less career-oriented, and they get lower wages just because they have lower firm-specific capital. Or, according to the labor segmentation theory, these people who move frequently between jobs, they belong to vulnerable categories. So they just move between bad jobs at the secondary labor market. And in this traditional career, and we move from traditional career to transitional career. But I must note that in Japan, last year I spent 3 months, a lot of employers and just people, they still believe in this traditional career theory and approach. But now we move to a new labor market, to technological changes, new norms, more flexibility and certainty. So new career theories appear. And these concepts of boundary-less protean, precarious, and other careers. And here is the picture of Greek god Proteus, who could foresee his future and change the shape, change his appearance as the situation demanded. And that's why we have this adjective protean and protean career. People can foresee their future, can change their skills as this future demands, and then be happy moving to the better future. And according to this approach, it is mainly developed by psychologists, business psychologists, individuals, these career attitudes. They welcome flexibility and they use mobility between jobs at their advantage. They get higher wage, they are more satisfied, and in fact, according to this transitional career approach, protean and boundaryless careers, wages are not so important for employees. Employees are think more about their psychological well-being. So they move from wages only as one of the most important aspects of job to more aspects that provide psychological well-being. But transitional career can have a dark side, and as Roman god Janus, which opens or closes the doors. He opens the doors to successful people and who have a smooth transition, but he doesn't open his doors to some people who can have some multiple disadvantages at the labor market, and so they are highly mobile because they churn between series of precarious dead-end jobs. And this part is very similar to labor market segmentation theory. As usual, there is a lot of literature on job mobility and its effect mainly on wages in the US because of the data availability. Some literature in the UK, Japan, some European countries. Studies in slow reforming transition economies, they are mainly they were mainly focused on transitions between employment, unemployment, displacement in the early 90s, in 2000s, and these transitions are not related to voluntary mobility, mainly displacement because of closure of enterprises. And the recent ILO reports on youth employment trends and school-to-work transition, they present some relevant evidence, but without analysis of cumulative job mobility, which is present in the data collected by the ILO. So research questions, what are the patterns of job mobility in the first 5 years after exit from education in slow reforming transition economies? Why slow reforming transition economies? Because many of these countries, they inherited very strict employment protection legislation and segmented labor market. So it is interesting to see what are the patterns of job mobility and compare them to those which are in developed countries. And then what are the consequences of early labor market experiences on current labor market status of young people, young adults, and their subjective well-being at work. And then is there a difference between those who quit their jobs voluntarily and those who left because of dismissal or end of the very short-term temporary contract. And my hypothesis is that in line with the new career theory, I believe that people who move voluntarily between jobs, they have better skills, soft skills, they are better able to cope with some flexibility and uncertainty, and so they have lower probability of precarious employment and joblessness, higher job satisfaction, and higher wages. I use data from the ILO School to Work Transition Survey, a household survey of young people aged from 15 to 29 in 5 post-Soviet countries and 3 post-Yugoslavian countries. In Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Macedonia, Moldova, Montenegro, Russia, Serbia, and Ukraine. The latest, the second round in most countries, and in Kyrgyzstan it was only 1 round. And we started this, my co-author, who is my student, they started from a very difficult task of joining 8 different data sets into one, different codes, different variable names, and then this table shows steps of sample construction. We excluded current students, we excluded people who exited from education less than 5 years ago, because we need to look at their first 5 years after education, and some individuals with some problems in reporting these retrospective activities. And so we end up at the sample of 6,000 individuals, and here is some descriptive statistics. What is interesting that I would like to show is these statistics for education level, and we see huge difference as expected in Ukraine, Russia, and Armenia. Very high share of people at this post-secondary and tertiary education, and at the same time very low share of higher educated people in Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. So we see this difference between post-Soviet and post-Yugoslavian countries in terms of educational attainment. And the average age is about 26, 27 years. And we look at the 5-year period, but then we have about 3 years more to look on their experience in the end during the interview. Then the very important and time-consuming step was construction of this calendar for each person in this sample. If we we had retrospective information about all activities after the end of education or after entry to the labor market, and constructed this calendar for each person, and two ways, two types of statuses, 3 statuses: just employed, unemployed, inactive, and the second approach, 12 statuses of jobless before the first job, no job after second job, and so on. And here is the example of a Ukrainian person who graduated from vocational school, worked 1 month, then left job because of unsatisfactory conditions, was inactive during a year, then was looking for a job, and worked then during November 2009, January 2014, and then for us it is not interesting at the moment, but then he he left job because he was dismissed because of this military conflict in Donbass. And then he spent a year in military service, I think, in NATO. And currently he was unemployed. So we constructed these calendars for each person. And second step is construction of dependent explanatory variables. Very important variable is precarious employment. I follow dialogue guidelines, so employees hired on the basis of oral agreement or informal employed people. Employees, these short-term, limited duration contract up to 12 months, so really short-term contract. And also employees without access to annual paid leave, paid sick leave, and social security contributions. Also, second group, necessity-driven or involuntary self-employed workers and all unpaid family workers. And standard approach to the definition of job satisfaction. At main job, all workers of all employment status answered to this question, and hourly wage answered only by employees. And these are the results. I constructed these graphs for all 8 countries, but here I will present for Ukraine, Moldova, starting from Ukraine, because it is more interesting for me and I think for the audience. And what they see, that this shows that at the beginning, we had already about 15% of people who were employed at the beginning, and we see a huge decrease in the share of inactive. Then they move to unemployment, but then by the end of the 5th year, we see that the share of people who are unemployed, young people, it is very small, and the large share of employed people. And here we see that they have this yellow. Many of them still have the first job, but this pink series show that a lot of people, Ukrainian young people, have a second job. And what is interesting, some of them have a third job, and here green 4th job. And why I show Ukraine? Ukrainians have the highest job mobility out of 8 countries. For comparison, we have Moldova. It stands out in terms of the share of inactive people. If we look here, we expect that the share of inactive people, it decreases this time after graduation. But we see here that it doesn't decrease. And if we look on this graph, we see that it is partly because some people, they cannot find or do not want to find a first job, but what is important, and also Moldova stands out in this respect, that a lot of people, they are jobless and mainly inactive, not unemployed. We don't see here unemployed. They are inactive. Inactive after first job, inactive after second job. And then I will show a graph, and I explain this by very important impact of migration. Remittances sent by parents, and then migration, that young people, they don't want to, they have a high reservation wage, and after trying some job in Moldova, they don't want to work at all in Moldova, or they look for some job outside. And here, for comparison, two post-Yugoslavian countries. And what we see, huge share of people who stay in unemployment till the end of this 5-year post-schooling period. So unemployment, and it is in line, these general statistics for these Balkan countries, that youth unemployment, long-term employment are the characteristics of the labor market because of institutional structural factors. And we see here that a lot of people, they stay jobless before the first job they cannot find or don't want to find. And if they find first job, they try to keep it. A lot of people, they stay on this first job, and some movement. And these graphs show reasons for job separations by education, and we see that in Ukraine, in Russia, most job separations by young people are voluntary. And here what I wanted to show for Moldova, important reason for separation is migration. And for Montenegro, for Serbia, for Macedonia, important reason for both both groups of bioeducation, important reason is dismissal, layoff, or end of temporary contract. So we see that in post-Soviet countries, most job separations are mainly voluntary, or because of migration, family, but still voluntary. And in these countries, post-Yugoslavian, many of them are caused by dismissal. And this table shows comparison of average number of jobs during 5-year post-schooling period and also 3-year for comparison with other countries. And we see that Ukraine is really on the first place. The job mobility of young people after finishing education is really high, higher than in other countries. But then we add some comparative results for developed countries. France has the lowest among these developed countries, and US the highest. And we see that in Ukraine, this level is still lower than in the country, in the developed country. This is the lowest level of mobility, and France is known with very regulated labor market and very strong trade unions. And then this econometric analysis is very preliminary, but I tried to look at the impact of this early labor market experience, share of time during these 5 years spent in employment, number of jobs during 5 years, share of voluntary job separations, and we see that mobility has expected results, that the share spent in employment and number of jobs, they decrease the probability of joblessness and precarious employment, and involuntary job separations during the first 5 post-schooling period, 5-year, increases this both probabilities of joblessness and precarious employment. And I also looked on some migration between areas and people who moved to other areas for other reasons, not related to education or employment. They are more likely to be jobless. And then a lot of other characteristics not included here. As regards satisfaction, we see some support of my hypothesis that job mobility is associated with higher job satisfaction among all people of all employment statuses, but not among employees. Important characteristics: uncertainty. If uncertainty bothers people, so they do not like flexibility, they have lower satisfaction. And I don't like these results for wages, but I need to work more. No effect of previous experience, probably because tenure is very important. And to support results presented by Harmut for Ukraine, and here we see for all countries that employees working informally without written contract, they have higher wages than employees working formally. And also those who have access to transport, some meals allowances, and many other bonuses, they also have higher wages. And what is also interesting, I also like to look at the trade union effect, and we see that members of trade union, they have lower wages than non-men. So the effect of trade unions, as usual, as I expected in our countries, it is negative. And so conclusions, yes, we have post-Soviet, post-Yugoslavian countries, huge difference in terms of the share of young people in unemployment and long-term youth unemployment and generally low voluntary mobility in post-Yugoslavian countries, and extremely high share of inactive youth in Moldova. And migration plays an important role. Ukraine has the highest level of youth mobility, but still lags behind developed countries. And some support of hypothesis that successful start of transitional career is associated with lower probability of joblessness, some extent lower probability of precarious employment, higher job satisfaction, and at the moment no effect on wages. And as regards policy implications, I like policy implications. I think our post-Yugoslavian countries need to follow these two basic policy formulas used in the EU. And in fact, Youth on the Move is an initiative for young people in the EU Agenda 2020 strategy. Flexibility plus security is flexicurity, mobility plus education is mobication. And just cultivate these protean career attitudes among youth. They are responsible for their career and future in general. Remove all kinds of barriers to free mobility of workers between jobs and areas, and support vulnerable youth. So they need, because if they face difficulties during the start of their career, then they are trapped in these precarious jobs, and they have in that end jobs. And thank you for attention, and I will be ready to show you, for example, for Armenia, Kyrgyzstan later, if you like.
Very wonderful. Thank you very much. And the discussant is Karine Torosyan.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I have some slides, if we can, please. Olga, thank you very much for your work. I want to compliment all the efforts. I know how it is to work with large data sets, and if you have to merge and clean and all sorts of things. And the topic is very actual, very interesting. I mean, I am from the Caucasus myself, and I know situation there, and it's a big issue, youth unemployment, employment, and then future career as a result. So I know this work is in initial stages, sort of, because the draft, at least that I saw, was preliminary. So I focused mostly on some suggestions and comments that are very practical and might help you to maybe structure your work. So one thing that I noticed is that you mentioned a very interesting source of data, and then when I looked at it, it seems that they have more data actually. You are using later waves, but I wonder why not using all the waves. That adds like as you can see, a lot of data. And I can imagine that more observations can only help you to do a lot of, again, backup checks that I will mention down the road. So hopefully you have all the codes and other things, but I don't think you want to waste 40% of the data by just looking at the latest wave. So that is my kind of first comment. Another thing I want to point out here, when you look at when the surveys were done, these are very different periods. Something in February would look very different from something done in June. And I think you should control for when you are ultimately looking at current like job situation. And I think February might be very different from July. So maybe you want to focus on those aspects. So yeah, so use all years control for months period. Another thing I want to point out, it seems all of the surveys are nationally representative except for Russia, and it says 11 regions. So maybe just double check what are these regions. Can you rely on that as like Russia kind of relevant? So my main thing is that, especially if you have more data, you highlight very nicely the differences in all those countries. Some countries are giant, like I would say Russia and Ukraine are very large compared to Armenia and Montenegro or like Macedonia. And you didn't show all the nice figures that you have in the appendix, but you look at them and you immediately see also the difference in the unemployment, employment, and then the mobility. So I think that, again, given more data on those countries, I would stress that you probably want to go deeper and look at maybe similar countries together instead of putting all of the countries together like you do now. You would see a lot of country-specific kind of aspects, and maybe mobility in Russia is one thing. Not maybe, it is. I mean, you have a big country with many industries. People can kind of go different regions, etc. In countries like Armenia, where you have two industries and you have huge issues with labor market, finding employment, mobility there usually is you go abroad, right? So you lose mobile people there, and you then have also sample selection issues in countries like, again, Macedonia or Armenia. So I would, especially for comparative kind of perspective, look at those kind of groups of countries, think of what would be the best way to package your countries, and then highlight the differences given, again, the size or some aspects that you're looking at. So, so some of the kind of finer suggestions that I have are, again, just reading the draft of the paper. I like very much the front part, but it seems like maybe you are working in steps on things, so I would like to see a little bit more connection between, again, the measures you introduce down the road. I think they have to be introduced a bit earlier and discuss. So you define mobility. I mean, I was wondering as I was reading, not until the regression results, I was clear about what is it that you term mobility. Is it number of jobs you have? Then I saw it, yes. It could be mobility between industries. It could be mobility counting change in status, not just how many jobs you have, but like, so why is your measure better, your measures better or worse? So try to put them in the perspective of literature and maybe discuss what do they mean, what do you capture with those measures of mobility. I would be also interesting to talk earlier on about main outcomes that you're going to compare. So again, probability of having precarious job, stable job, or being, you term it jobless. By the way, at this stage, I noticed that you put into jobless unemployment and inactivity. You have to make a case for this. Why? I mean, these are two different states. And if you're inactive, you don't look for jobs. If you're unemployed, you look and you cannot find jobs. And these are two very different situations. So I don't know if it's because you didn't have enough observations in certain countries, because basically inactivity was such a slim line. But again, try to explain these things and talk about them. And again, define these things much earlier. I mean, precarious job description came only later in your work. Try to also in your literature reflect if it has been picked up in literature before. So another point, maybe again, very technical. I know with data, one has to be very specific about things. So it seems that there are different definitions of what counts as a job in different countries. You mentioned that. So in Armenia, for example, it has to be 3 months or more, and then it's a job spell. In Serbia, it's 1 month. And this makes a huge difference. I mean, in Armenia, many people have 2 months jobs in summer and then whatever. So given you have duration that you observe, could you maybe define yourself that I'm going to count all jobs that are 3 months or more, even in Serbia? So you have a uniform definition of what is a job, because by itself, that already will affect your mobility. And then, I mean, you don't want to do that. You want a uniform definition. So, yeah, I will probably skip here. Some other things are maybe you want to dive into country-specific details, because they all have some issues that you might want to be aware of. For example, in Armenia, all young men have to serve for 2 years. It's almost all. So you finish school, and you enter your 5-year kind of period, 60 months. 40% of that you're in the army, which basically cuts your options of working for 3 years, which you cannot compare to other countries. So I wonder if there are other specific periods in other countries that you have to take into account. Also, these main variables, as you define and discuss them, would be nice to see some summary statistics as it goes along. There are some interesting summaries, but I think you have to, add some on those as well. Now, just a few minor points. I wonder if there is recall bias. So in your survey, you would see people such as 23-year-old young men at the moment of the survey. And for them, they just finished the 5 years, and they are now in the job market. So they remember much better what happened in these 5 years. If somebody, you look at 29-year-old person, it's a couple of years down the road that he has basically to recall the 5 years after graduation, so might remember worse. Also, what happens between those 22 and 29 years? What happens, the experience during these years, between the 5 years and now? Do you account for that in any way, and what might be important? One way to do this, maybe, especially if you have more observations, if you split data for younger people versus older people. So those already had some education and experience, and those are fresh, kind of out of this 5-year period. You might see more comparable results. Also, in many countries, people lie or hide their jobs, in Armenia for sure, and for reasons like, I'm just lazy to tell you that I also had this job. We had in Georgia a very difficult experience collecting data like that. So also, this is why you might want to focus on countries a little bit more. Yeah, these are not vital to save time. I will forward the slides then. Okay, thank you very much for your work and good luck.
Thank you very much. Wow, this was, that's the kind of review you hope for when you go to a conference. Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. Yeah, the microphone. All right, so we have, once again, we have an hour for coffee break. I think we can not now, but in 20 minutes-ish. So we'll just extend the session for about 10-15 minutes. I hope you don't mind. So questions? Do we have questions? Yes, there is a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, it would be a question both for Olga and for Hartman somehow, and it's regarding the wages. So the wages that you're looking for, you're asking basically the question, what is your wage? And you're looking at formal and informal employees, right? And my big concern is that in a country like Ukraine, there is a huge issue of envelope wages, right? So you can have a formal contract, you can be registered, so you can be considered as a formal employee with a formal wage, but then you receive a real wage in an envelope that is very different from what is stated. So to what extent do you think the surveys, the two different surveys that you are using, reflect the real wages that people actually really receive as compared to what they write in the contract, and then they somehow feel obliged to do the survey to tell what the wage is, and to what extent that may actually influence the results? Thank you.
Let me answer this for the ULMS. I mean, we do, I wrote this in the paper actually, obviously when you do this wage gap analysis, you have to compare apples with apples, no? So basically the question is, what is the actual net wage, the actual net wage that you got? Now, if people are honest, they will tell you the actual net wage, which actually should include envelope payments. You don't ask them for envelope payments because they would never. But if you just say, what's your actual net wage? Because the informal, since they don't pay Social Security contribution, taxes, and so on, it's a net wage. And so you have to ask the formal ones also a net wage. And with the informal self-employed or the self-employed, you ask the net income. And then you ask for actual hours, and that allows you to come up with an actual hourly wage rate or earnings rate. So But of course, I mean, I did mention this in the presentation, that there were lots of things that you have to consider. These envelope payments is one, but maybe people are, if they're honest, they will tell you the actual wage, not their contractual wage.
And in my story as WTS, the question is, the last time you were paid in your main job, how much did you receive in wages and salaries? Wages and salaries include the regular payment, commissions, tips, shift work, pay for overtime, regular cash bonuses, and remuneration for time not worked. So the question is supposed to provide information about total wages. The other question is how young people answer. And the problem, that's why I don't like to analyze wages in our country and in post-Soviet countries. The problem is that they do not answer this question at all. And they have then second question. So if you may not recall the exact amount, put some brackets. And if we have some information in brackets, it is very difficult to analyze. That's why I do not put a lot of emphasis here in my work on wages, but more on satisfaction and on joblessness and precarious employment.
All right, thank you.
And I just want to tell a lot of thanks to Karine. Fantastic review, suggestions, and I will take into account because it is just a start, really. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I have to once again resort to bring us back on time. So I encourage you to ask more questions during the coffee break. So I give the floor to Hanna Onyszczenko.
I was not so experienced in doing the data debate. That's why I concentrated on wage in 3 countries: Armenia, Ukraine, and Russia. And the short outline is I try to do my presentation as short as possible and do not concentrate on a lot of technical data description analysis. And I knew that Olga Kupets will present it because we use the same data set. I also use School to Work Transition Survey for my work. So the idea is, why did I choose this topic? Was that actually this work is a updating of my master thesis, and I choose this because, as you know, in Ukraine we have really high enrollment ratio, and the situation in higher education, the situation is the same for Russia and Armenia, and it is expected that after the dying of Soviet Union, these countries inherited very good educational system. And Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia had the highest level of enrollment and highest quality of education during the Soviet Union. Armenia was between, and Kyrgyzstan and other countries, they were below as based on the enrollment ratio. And it was expected that it will be the advantage, technical, strategic advantage for our countries to have such a good education and expectedly high quality of human capital. But finally, if you look at the nearest data, the quality of tertiary education in these 3 countries that I choose because of the high enrollment ratio, they are really low. And even 70th place in Romania, and the quality of that job training is we expect more from this. And the probable reason that were widely discussed by our previous representative Olga Kupets was the skill and educational job mismatch in her previous works, and they encouraged me to look more. And as far as I understand, the result of high education enrollment ratio is the oversupply of graduates with higher education in the labor market, and expectedly lower wage, and some labor market distortion. And I used and read a lot by our previous presented Olga Kupets, and last her Kyoto work, he presented the evidence of wide over-education incidents in Ukraine and Armenia. Specifically, you point that the group of elder people, like they are more, there is a greater incidence of over-education. And I found the evidences of this problem in papers about Russian. Galiusova notes the widespread, and even she raised the question how to resolve with the state help, what government could do to resolve the problem. And also thinking about the impact of well-being, I found the paper of Verfostan and Omeis, and found that youth cohort is the most vulnerable group of people in terms of influence of educational level on their well-being. And literature suggests that the overeducation has negative effect. Oh, I forgot to tell that overeducation means that person has a higher level of education than is expected to have the job. And I mean, for example, you are working as a clerk, but you have the complete higher education, like a master's degree. My motivation is how does the oversupply of youth with tertiary education affect their labor market, and investigate the effect of under and over education on their wages. And I will just tell you basic results to give you some feelings. Ukrainians are much more educated than their peers from other countries. For example, in Ukraine, the average number of attained education is for all occupation, 7 groups of occupation, is the bachelor degree. For example, in Ukraine, in Russia, elementary occupation requires, like the average number of years is 9 years, like 9 years of schooling to work and occupy basic occupation. Females suffer from overqualification in Ukraine, and it is the only result among 3 countries by gender. And we find an impact of overeducation and wage among females on Ukraine and Armenia. And our model shows absence of sample selection for all cohorts of youth except the Russian males. And the good news that attained education is still the formal indicator for employers during the process of recruitment. In our paper we present an extensive literature review. We presented all theories that explains over-education, including human capital theory, job competition model, like everything you can find there. We stopped at the Verdugo-Oro specification, which in the left hand, the dependent variable is log of the wage. And the crucial idea is that the years of attained education is put here, and dummies for over-education and over-education is also present. And now when we assess the impact of the dummy of over-education, we compare the person with his peers that has the same year of education. We expect that, like, to explain it, that there are 2 persons that had the same level of education, probably even in the same field, and one works in the work that requires this education, and another works on the work with the lower level. And this coefficient will show the wage penalty. Why I stop here? Because you could easily miss this with required years of education. And if you put this required years education, you will compare the person on the same job, but with not peers from the university, but with peers on the work, and the coefficients will be completely different. And it is expected that this coefficient near over-education will be negative and coefficient near under-education will be positive. And there is also always problem of selection bias when the internal, like the heterogeneity of the population. Somebody get a job, somebody no, and we should count for that. And we used Heckman two-step specifications to control for this problem. And my data, as I mentioned, I also used school-to-work transition surveys, which was extensively explained by Olga. And I put it only 2 graphs in the section of data because I think these 2 are crucial for that. We used the statistical approach to define the required years of education. It was like we had 7 groups of occupation, like managers, professionals, clerical support, etc. And we said we take an average year for each group of education and defined it as the required year of education. Not average, but mode. And in our paper, we explained why we choose mode approach instead of the mean approach. And after that, in our question, we have a self-assessment question. And the self-assessment questions ask a person whether you think you are overqualified or underqualified. And when we look at this, we see that most of the respondents think their education are relevant. However, due to the statistical approach, they consider to be overeducated and undereducated. For example, in Ukraine, the group of people that think that they are overqualified is the lowest among all countries. However, still there is the case that persons seems to be overqualified, at the same time it is overeducated. But the idea that finally, it could be an evidence of the credential inflation when the person is actually overeducated, but their skills fits well for the work. Another one is the kernel density plots for the wage for the men, for female and males across these countries, and it is you can clearly see that males have a higher wage, and their distribution is wider, which means that like their market could be considered as more developed, and women have well, especially in Ukraine, they have very concentrated density, which means that the really big share of women have a really low job wage. Low wage. I just decided to focus on the second stage and variables of interest. And we find out that for female in Ukraine and Armenia, there is unexpectedly similar coefficients. There is a significant penalty for overeducation. It's almost 17%. But in addition, female in Ukraine suffers of overqualification. Based on the data, like when we did the data descriptions, we find out that females actually are undereducated in the occupations where they constitute the majority. And it looks like that females in Ukraine have like an average, have higher average level, years of attained education, and they like probably they could overcome the problem with, for example, the marital status of future children, and they get more and more education to be competitive on the market. Russia shows like we get the coefficients that don't go in line with expected. It's for Russia. Overeducated and undereducated person have positive sign, and they benefit from the educational mismatch. And like Karina, I looked at the 11 regions, and they predominantly are the Eastern Russia. So that means that they are more looks like the Ukraine and the European countries. And I think that we could explain this by the horizontal mismatch, then person switch from the one industry, educational industry, to another, and for example, like physics, they get more money for their analytical skills in different, in other fields, even they are considered to be over or under-educated. Years of attained education is significant for females in Ukraine and Russia, and significant for males in Armenia. And I'm personally interested why is this situation for females. I know the ideas for males. I know that the idea of higher like discrimination of female in Armenia in the work, and high migration among the males. Probably it could be a case, and we are still investigating it. And the first stage Hickman showed us that the first stage is significant only for males in Russia. And it showed us that years of attained education is significant and increase the probability to get a job. And I forgot to tell that in the second stage, we also put the variable that moved previously when you moved from another region, and it was also insignificant in our model. So that is go with line with the findings of Olga, your previous presentation. And all other coefficients goes in line as expected. Experience squared is significant, and female in Armenia and Russia, they experienced high negative penalty for being married, and it's all with line with the literature. And to sum up, we can see from the statistic that the markets in 3 countries are imperfect, and a significant share of people, according to self-assessment, experience a qualification mismatch, as well as according to the statistical approach, they consider to be mismatched in terms of formal education. Years of attained education influence differently the wage of across the country, the wage of the youth, but they are still useful to when they are trying to get a job. The further steps is to include 2 waves of school-to-work transition surveys to our research for Armenia and Ukraine. Because for Russia, for example, there are some questions that are just missed in second wave, and I looked at all the countries that Olga presented and their waves, and the second wave has often has very low quality, poor quality compared to the first wave. That's why, but no, it's easier to use it. For example, from my perspective about the questions, and actually in the future we'll control for the horizontal job mismatch, just to consider dummy variables when persons switch their field of education to the job. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. All right, and the discussant is Gintare Palisauskaite.
So first of all, I'd like to pay the compliments. I was very intrigued to read the article, and I thought it was accomplished to a very high standard already. Plus, it's a very valuable contribution in the field of this literature, as it is definitely very important to understand the processes in transition economies, how education relates to work, especially for the youth, and in order to make informed policy decisions. Plus, I was really fascinated with the literature review that you provided. It was very extensive, very detailed, looking at all the possible methods to approach the idea, and which gave a very good motivation to methodology that you chose to use, which I think was really great. I do have a few questions, which I think they're more likely to be clarification questions, and potentially just adding some explanation in the text. So first of all, you use the index for the quality of education. Obviously, you take it from the internet, which is great, but maybe you could add an explanation what exactly the quality of education means expressed by that index, because that could potentially add to the explanation of your article ideas as well. Then you very nicely explain and how you define overeducated and undereducated, and you express it in two ways, which is in years and as a dummy, but you then use another term, which is overqualified and underqualified, and I could not find an explanation of how you define that in an article. Then there's a comparison between the three countries of required level of education for the positions of work. And I also didn't quite find is the required level sort of the official level within the country, or is it just the mean in each country? So basically, is it more objective or subjective measure? Then you already partially answered that in your presentation in regards to gender. I was reading and I was slightly confused. Initially, you mentioned that women tend to have a higher mean level of education in comparison to men, but then within your regressions, you report that for the position that they're at, women tend to be more likely undereducated. So I think a better connection would be good to explain how that actually works. So is it basically position-based? And probably another intriguing fact is that you mentioned most of the positions being more highly dominated by women, apart from managers. And also women being usually having lower wages. I think these are all interesting insights that could be connected together better. Now, very similar to the previous comment made before for the previous article, you look into the relationship between wages and level of education, etc. How exact do you think the level of wages is? So basically, how representative of the actual wages and how you can address that. So that also made me think of the possibility of corruption, but on a slightly different level. So it's not only about underreporting the wages, but also in regards to getting the job. Since you are basically interested in the youth and they're getting their jobs, what is the possibility that some of those jobs are acquired not based on their achievements, like educational achievements, but based off the contacts that they have? I do wonder what the data set could offer to control in regards to that. Maybe there could be some proxy for family information that would allow. I was actually kind of intrigued with the variable that you use and found not significant, which is the distance traveled for the job. My movement, yes, I'm sorry. For Ukraine and Armenia, most people actually do migrate, while for Russia they don't. And in Russia is the country that has the lowest required education level. So I do wonder if that is anyhow connected. Then finally, you report all the separate country regressions. I'm sure you must have ran some pooled regressions as well to see the effect of the regressors overall. Maybe you could just add some information or discuss what you found there. And finally, a very, very small mistake. On page 7, you're trying to compare the betas between a required obtained overeducation and undereducation. And you basically just, I think one of them has to be different, because you say that beta of the required education is more than beta of required education. And that's all. So I do think it was a very interesting read, and I really enjoyed.
Thank you so much. All right, we have time for a few questions. There is one from...
I have a question regarding the methods that you use. You mentioned mode and mean-based methods. Did you use occupation at 2 or 3 digit? At what digit? So the problem is that the sample is really small. The number of employed people, these reported occupation is very small among young people. There are many of them, as I showed, inactive and unemployed. And the problem is that then you use 2-digit occupation. The measurement error is very large because you compare teachers, for example, of different school, different levels, and in one 2-digit occupation and so on. So you can have spurious over-education or under-education because this occupation is very large. And my second question, why did you use both overqualification, underqualification, over-education, or under-education in the same regression?
Because I just focused on the formal educational level, which doesn't imply and I had no control for ability and the quality of education per se. That's why, and the question in the questionnaire is about how do you assess particularly your qualification, because person could get additional training from during the job experience and etc. And what about this mid and mode approach? I looked in the paper, you could look at the distribution, and it is really concentrated. So there are only few educational levels for each occupation, and they are mostly in some place. So there are just 10 or 20% of mismatch, educational mismatch, and I think it doesn't produce a great mistake.
Thank you. Well, I keep saying we have time for few questions, and that's a lie. We only have time for one. If you do, the coffee break is already at full swing, so I would like to invite you there and encourage once again to ask your questions if you have more questions to the presenters. Then the sections will be divided, so for the next section, it'll be one big hall here, so don't get surprised when you go back and it's one big room. All right, thank you once again, everyone.